We are live. Hello, everyone. I am Sonia from Worksite Tasmania, and I will be a moderator today. This session is Neurodiversity and Neurodivergence in the Workplace, presented by Dr. Miro Rainsford from Positive Solutions. In recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, we acknowledge Tasmanian Aboriginal people, the original and continuing custodians of the land, sea, and sky. We acknowledge and pay our respects to all Tasmanian Aboriginal people, all of whom have survived invasion and dispossession and continue to maintain their identity, culture, and Aboriginal rights. Now, please take a moment to read the following slide about information you'll receive today. Use the chat tab on your right-hand side to type any questions you have for today's presenter. Those questions will be answered at the end of the webinar, and only presenter webcams will be used. Today's presentation is also being recorded and will be available on Worksite Tasmania's YouTube channel towards the end of the month. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Dr. Miro Rainsford from Positive Solutions. Dr. Miro, with pronouns he, they, is a counsellor, clinical member of the Psychotherapy and Counselling Federation of Australia. He preaches in behavioural science research in Hobart, Tasmania. He provides trauma-informed therapy for LGBTIQA+, neurodivergent communities, drawing on EMDR and lived experience and research, memory, cognition, and legal decisions on gender-affirming care for trans youth. Miro also presents widely in conferences and through Positive Solutions webinar. Welcome, Miro, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Well, good morning, everybody. Just a little bit of an outline on what we're going to be covering today's session. So we've got 5 outcomes here. Firstly, just to understand the meaning of neurodiversity and neurodivergence and the difference between those two terms. After today, you'll also have an understanding of the experiences of neurodivergent people and the sort of issues they face day to day. You'll also gain an understanding of how neurodivergent women and non-binary people may have different experiences to men, and understand the needs of neurodivergent people in the workplace and how we can all work together to create a more inclusive workplace for everybody. I'll also be providing some very brief resources and referrals for support for those who are interested. So what is neurodiversity? We all think and learn and experience and interact with the world in different ways. And neurodiversity is an umbrella term, and it refers to the idea that our brains are all diverse in the way they develop. We all experience the world differently. In the same way, we are all physically diverse. So some of us are tall, some of us are short, some of us have larger or smaller bodies, different colours of hair or skin. We all have different physical abilities, and we're also all neurologically diverse. So the term neurodivergence refers to those people who specifically whose brains have developed differently to the majority, and the majority is referred to as neurotypical. Most people associate the word neurodivergence with autism and ADHD, but it actually refers to a really wide range of ways in which people experience the world. And this infographic on the right-hand side shows you some of the possible neurodivergences. You might notice that many of these end in a letter D because the medical classification uses the word disorder. And in neurodivergent affirming terms, people quite often drop the D, drop the word disorder, or they may abbreviate things and just use the abbreviation. And the neurodivergent umbrella graphic I've seen on the right, it does say it's a non-exhaustive list. So this is not the only list of things that can be neurodivergence. There are many examples. So, sorry, I'm having trouble moving to the next slide. Just one second. There we go. So why is neurodiversity important? Biodiversity theory says that the greater the diversity within an ecosystem, the more stable, the more adaptive, and the more sustainable that system is. So it's more likely to survive. And diversity means evolutionary advantage. We can adapt and survive better if we have a range of strengths and a range of differences. If we were all the same, we wouldn't be, that would limit our ability for survival. So from an evolutionary perspective, there are theories that neurodivergences have evolved and stuck around because they also give us competitive advantage. And to give an example of one of those things, ADHDers are often in calm in crisis situations where everybody else might be in a panic. And they work really well under pressure to tight deadlines, whereas neurotypical people may find those situations challenging. And if you think from an evolutionary perspective, we may have needed people who can be calm in a crisis for the human race to survive. So being neurodiversity affirming means focusing on our strengths rather than our deficits. And the next slide I have for you shows you some strengths associated with certain forms of neurodivergence. So over here we can see on the left, autism. Autistic folks are often known for having really good concentration, sustaining focus for a long period of time, being able to process things in fine detail, great attention to detail, and good memory for specific things. Over on the right, ADHD, people may have great creativity, again, the ability to hyperfocus and great energy and passion. You might notice on here that some neurodivergences can be acquired as well. And on the first slide, there was acquired brain injury as one possible neurodivergence, along with things like complex PTSD and PTSD that fall into mental health. People with those experiences may have great depth of thinking, adaptability, and great empathy because of their lived experience. So see, these are some of the strengths that come with neurodivergence. So what does it mean to be neurodivergent affirming? That means recognizing that everyone has their own strengths and challenges, and that our differences are not problems to be solved, or deficits. Affirming neurodivergence means celebrating all these differences. It means allowing people to be themselves. And it means recognizing that we all have different needs and adapting to meet those needs. So when we are talking about neurodiversity, you may have noticed that I am using a little bit of different language here. Many neurodivergent people use identity first rather than person first language. So they use the words autistic or ADHDer instead of person with ASD or person with ADHD. So the person first language, the person with language, came out of the mental health recovery movement. And the aim of that is to separate the person from the condition, which is helpful for things like, say, a person with alcohol use issues, rather than labeling somebody as alcoholic, which is really deficit focused and rather derogatory. But it's not helpful for neurodiversity because to many people, neurodiversity is an identity and it can't be separated from who they are. So it's about embracing their neurodiverse identity. To use the language person with autism suggests that autism is somehow limiting, or that the person could be without autism, that autism is something that could be cured, which it is not. So this differs a lot from the medical model and how language is used there, which is much more disorder focused and deficit focused. Having said, you've met one neurodivergent person, you've met one neurodivergent person. Always ask a person what language they use, because everybody has the right to choose the language they use to refer to themselves. A few other language points and language to avoid. We used to use the terms high functioning and low functioning, and we don't use that anymore because it's not inclusive language. It actually makes value judgments as to how well a person fits within neurotypical standards, like having a typical life, having a typical job, having a typical family. It also doesn't tell you anything about that person's internal experience. And that sort of language around functioning encourages masking. There may be a lot going on internally when somebody is presenting outwardly as fitting in with neurotypical standards. So it's actually better to refer to a person's current strengths and abilities and their support needs, because we all have those. We all have strengths, we all have strong abilities, we also all have needs for support. So this is much more inclusive. Also, the language verbal and non-verbal is one to avoid. So we use speaking and non-speaking instead, because that acknowledges that there are many different ways to communicate and that speech is only one of those. Some neurodivergent people actually communicate better through means other than speech. So I'm going to talk a little bit in depth about certain common forms of neurodivergence. Starting off with autism, I'll also talk a bit about ADHD. So in the DSM, with the deficit-focused language that I talked about in the medical model, autism is classified as autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. The neurodivergent affirming term is autistic. Some people in the past may have been diagnosed with what was called Asperger's syndrome, and that's now been incorporated in the DSM under ASD. So it's acknowledged that autism is a spectrum of different experiences. The symbol on the right is for autism acceptance. So you may have seen a jigsaw puzzle, but that's not considered affirming because it implies there's something missing, and there's nothing missing in autistic people. So according to the classifications in the DSM, and I'm going to reframe the more deficit-focused language here. So autistic people may experience differences in the way they communicate and interact with other people. They may have difficulty specifically in understanding nonverbal cues and the sort of subtext in conversation that neurotypical people tend to use, where they're less direct and where things are implied. So autistic people may have difficulty understanding neurotypical social expectations. They may have a preference for routines. People may also stim, which is like sort of using fidget toys, movement. It's a way of self-soothing the nervous system. And many neurodivergent folks of different neurominorities may use stimming. People may also develop special interests in particular topics. And that term SPINS, that abbreviation, that is a reclaimed term where there was previously a sort of deficit-focused way of referring to special interests. So that's a community term, SPIN. People may also experience sensory sensitivities to things like foods, fabrics and clothing, and the tags in clothing. They may have sensitivities to noise or particular sounds and lighting. There are 3 different levels under the DSM, and this is where the support needs come in. So people may be sort of classified as requiring support, substantial support, or very substantial support. A little bit about ADHD. So ADHD involves differences in executive function, attention, emotions, and behaviour. And the identity first way of referring to a person who's been diagnosed with ADHD, or the long version of it, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is an ADHDer. There are 3 subtypes of ADHD. So there's the inattentive subtype, where people may have difficulty focusing and concentrating for long periods. They may be easily distracted and have their attention drawn to other stimuli. They may be forgetful, they may miss important details of tasks or forget to complete tasks. The hyperactive impulsive type, where people may be very sort of on the go, moving, fidgety and restless. They may find themselves easily bored. They may have difficulty with regulating emotions, and that sort of difficulty sitting still on the go like a motor. That can be a physical thing. It can also be an internal mental experience as well. People may have different ways of communicating, so interrupting in conversation or speaking before sort of processing fully what they are going to be talking about. There's also a combined type, which is a mixture of inattentive and hyperactive impulsive symptoms. And these are things which last throughout life, so they start before age 12 and affect all sort of aspects of life, work, home, and socialising. Some other specific challenges that ADHDers may experience are difficulty prioritising and planning, sensory differences, so they may notice many sensory stimuli at once, and it may also be different to sort of tune those things out. Difficulty with time management and time perception, difficulty with memory and losing things, as I mentioned, and also intense passions and interests. So spins are a feature of ADHD as well. So you might have noticed that I've been referring to some things, as I've talked about autism and ADHD, some of these things sound similar. Up until the DSM-5 was released in 2013, it was not possible to be diagnosed with both autism and ADHD, and we now know that these can co-occur. So the neurodiversity affirming term for someone who has that dual diagnosis is ADHD, and these can coexist. One of the challenges for ADHDers is that autistic and ADHD traits can conflict with each other, which means they may mask each other, or it may make recognition of the person's neurodivergence difficult because of that. On the next slide, I will give you some examples of this. So on the left, we have some features of ADHD. On the right, some autistic traits, and in the middle, ADHD, where both those things coexist. So, for example, where ADHDers prefer to do things on the spur of the moment and without planning. Autistic folks may prefer strict routines and familiarity. ADHDers may have a struggle between the two, where they may have a preference for routines, but then that's boring as well, and that's too much sameness. So it becomes a sort of two directions at once. And the same sort of thing with sensory overwhelm. For ADHDers, they may be sensory seeking. For autistic folks, they may be overwhelmed with that. So those two things may actually sort of coexist in ADHD. So a little bit about autism in women and non-binary people and people assigned female at birth. And because what we're starting to recognise is that autism may present differently in these folks, because much of the previous literature has been based on the experiences of cis men and boys. And when I say cis, that means somebody whose gender they were assigned at birth by the doctor is the same as the gender that they experience themselves. Whereas, so the word cis means the same as, whereas trans means opposite to. That is somebody whose gender is different from the gender that they were assigned at birth. So autism in women, girls, non-binary people, and people assigned female at birth may look like this. People may have spins focusing on animals, music, art, and literature. They may have a strong imagination, and they might escape into the worlds of nature and fiction. They might have a desire to arrange and organise objects, and that may be a sort of way of stimming and helping them self-regulate. They may have differences in play, so they might be the ones wanting to organise the rules of play, or they may prefer playing alone rather than the sort of turn-taking play with other peers, neurotypical peers. Something that quite often happens is that women, girls, non-binary people, people assigned female at birth are socialised to copy other people. So they may have a tendency to mimic other people in social situations to fit in. And they're sort of socialised to mask their differences, which means they may also hold in all their emotions when they're at school, but then experience a meltdown at home because that just gets way too stressful to just hold all of these things inside. They may also have strong sensory sensitivities, particularly to sounds and touch. As I mentioned before, clothing tags or sometimes seams, like the seams in socks, feel unbearable, or even deodorants and that sort of thing. I'll also talk a little bit, sorry, I'm just getting my mouse back, talk a little bit about ADHD in women, girls, and people assigned female at birth and non-binary people. So again, what we understand of ADHD has typically been based on the experience of cis boys. And this means women, girls, and people assigned female at birth and non-binary people more broadly may have been missed, particularly as more overt symptoms, the more sort of hyperactive impulsive subtype is more common in cis boys, and that's something that gets noticed in the classroom. And so they are more likely to be sort of picked up and referred to the school psychologist and referred for diagnosis and assessment. Whereas women, girls, non-binary people, and people assigned female at birth may be more likely to experience the inattentive subtype of ADHD, which looks like sort of daydreaming, maybe not completing work on time, difficulty making friendships, or talking hyperactively. And they may find that they get told off for talking in class, but otherwise, because their experience is quite internal and it's sort of daydreaming, the teacher just says, oh, you're not paying attention, and they don't, what's going on inside doesn't get picked up. Add to that women and girls and non-binary people are socialised to mask their symptoms. So this means people may be experiencing diagnoses later in life as well. I'm going to introduce two terms here, rejection-sensitive dysphoria, RSD, and pervasive drive for autonomy, PDA. And these are two things that neurodivergent people may experience. We typically associate PDA with autism, but it's not exclusive to that. ADHDers may experience that as well, and the same with rejection-sensitive dysphoria. It's often associated with ADHD, but autistic people and other neurodivergent folks may experience that. So PDA refers to a need for autonomy. There's a more stigmatizing name, pathological demand avoidance, but the neuroaffirming term is pervasive drive for autonomy. It is a survival response, and it's a survival response to the demands of a neurotypical world, which can show up as people then avoiding demands or instructions, or really strong anxiety and a need to be in control. Which, you know, if you think about how we respond to stress, many people have a need to be in control when they're experiencing stress. So it's in many ways a very natural response. So one of the ways to work with people who may experience this, to be inclusive and not stigmatizing, and to help them with that anxiety, is to talk in questions, to allow a person options so they may be more in control of their options and actions and situation, and to give them time to prepare when they're transitioning from one task to another. Rejection-sensitive dysphoria is like a really sort of intense physical, visceral, emotional pain that people experience, which is triggered by thinking they might be failing at something or have failed at something, rejection or criticism. And much of this comes from repeated experiences of being told over and over again, oh, you forgot to do that. Oh, you haven't done that right. Oh, you're interrupting. And so with those experiences mounting up, that sort of anticipation of emotional pain gets stronger and stronger. So again, with rejection sensitive dysphoria, when we are being more neuroaffirming and more neuroinclusive, and I've got some suggestions for that later when we talk about the workplace, we can help understand people's experiences, and we can understand what it's been like for them growing up being maybe not recognized or being judged for their neurodivergence. So this brings me to looking at the double empathy problem. So Milton is an autistic researcher, and he came up with the term the double empathy problem to explain the difficulties that neurotypical and neurodivergent people have in understanding each other. And this was because past researchers unfortunately suggested that autistic people lack empathy, which is not actually true. Autistic people may have very, very strong empathy. What they have is difficulty reading neurotypical people's behaviour. But the same goes for neurotypical people. Neurotypical people have difficulty reading autistic people's behaviour. Whereas within those groups, autistic people may have much less difficulty reading each other's behaviour, and the same for neurotypical people. But because neurotypical people are in the majority and their ways of communicating are expected, autistic people are expected to learn and conform to those standards, and that's where we have an empathy divide, where these two groups have difficulty reading each other. This goes for other neurodivergences as well. So the same thing can happen with ADHD, ADHD, or other neurodivergences. So with the amount of stress that people experience as neurodivergent people living in a world where there are neurotypical expectations, people are much more likely to experience burnout, anxiety, and depression. And these figures of co-diagnosis of a psychiatric condition are really, really high. So at age 25, 77% of autistic women and about 62% of autistic men are diagnosed with a co-occurring psychiatric condition. If you have a look at the rates of depression and anxiety in neurotypical populations, if I remember rightly from the statistics quoted in the DSM, that's somewhere between 3 and 6%. So it's much, much, much higher. And under recognition, misdiagnosis and burnout contribute to those rates. Neurodivergent people may also experience specific types of burnout. And this slide gives you a picture of what may happen. So it's a different kind of burnout to occupational burnout, where there may be a lot of exhaustion, worse executive function as well, which is the brain's ability to sort of plan and organize things, difficulties with emotional overwhelm and sensory overwhelm or social overwhelm. Something to note here is that if this looks familiar and if you are experiencing thoughts of self-harm, I would very strongly encourage you to seek professional support from your GP or from a counsellor or psychologist or social worker. So reducing burnout, I've got a little slide here which gives some strategies for reducing burnout. But overall, it means rest. It means reducing sensory stimulation. Minimizing social pressure as well, where there is a lot of stress around social interactions, and spending a little bit of time where you can unmask as well. where neurodivergent people often mask their differences and try to fit in with how neurotypical people expect things are done. That creates a lot of effort. So it's helpful to have time where it feels safe to unmask. We should never force somebody to unmask because that creates a whole heap of stress. But time alone might be time where it's just safe to be yourself, and to increase things like sensory soothing and stimming if that is needed, or spending time on special interests that can be the spins that can be really restorative. Seeking support from other people can be helpful if that's appropriate, but some people may need to just spend time alone as well. It might be helpful to connect with other neurodivergent people who have similar experiences where there isn't that double empathy problem. But learning self-compassion is also helpful, validating that it's okay to be alone if that's what you need. It's okay to take care of your own needs. It's okay to be yourself, and showing the same kindness to ourselves that we probably very naturally show to other people. So on to a bit about neurodiversity and neurodivergence in the workplace. And what does this all mean for the workplace? As I mentioned at the start, people who have different forms of neurodivergence may have different strengths, and this can be an advantage in workplace teams. Similar to the biodiversity theory, this may be a competitive advantage for teams as well. And an article recently published in the Harvard Business Review described neurodiversity as a competitive advantage, including all neurotypes, as we refer to them, whether neurotypical or neurodivergent, including everyone in a professional team, boosts morale and boosts productivity. So I mentioned some of the strengths of neurodivergences earlier on in this presentation. In the workplace, those might include things like creative thinking, the ability to process and remember things, and attention to detail and accuracy. Neurodivergent folks may have elevated productivity where they're able to focus for long periods. They may have an ability to take a different perspective on things, or have great empathy in particular situations. Neurodivergent folks may have high levels of engagement and loyalty as well to the work and to their team. So including everybody together is an advantage for the workplace. However, unfortunately, often neurodivergent people are expected to conform to the majority and to conform to neurotypical norms. In Tasmania, we actually have a responsibility under the Anti-Discrimination Act to not discriminate against people with a protected attribute, and that does include neurodivergence. So this means being aware of our biases and avoiding things like microaggressions and direct and indirect discrimination. So direct discrimination happens when a person is treated unfairly because of a particular attribute, such as denying a person a job because they're neurodivergent. Whereas indirect discrimination happens when everybody appears to be treating the same, and there's a rule that for everybody that seems to be on the surface treating everybody as the same, but actually has the effect of disadvantaging some people because of their particular attributes. And that might be things like expecting that all workers can meet and function in a room with harsh overhead lighting and high flicker and noise, which would affect a neurodivergent person's sensory experiences. Unconscious biases are when we may tokenize or treat somebody specially in a way that we wouldn't for neurotypical people. It may also include stigmatizing people and negativity towards neurodivergence. And microaggressions, that term means this sort of everyday experiences of stigma and discrimination which add up over time. That might be making assumptions about people's needs as well, and overstepping boundaries and giving help where it's not needed, or expecting everybody, as I mentioned with the indirect discrimination to sort of conform to the norm. And over time, those things may add up. So we all have a responsibility here. To create an affirming workplace, then, we need to respect and embrace individual differences. And so what I will say here, though, just to sort of give you a few limitations around my qualifications as a counsellor, I'm not really able to speak to specific workplace adjustments. I have some general information here, but what I would encourage people to do if they have needs in the workplace is to talk to their people and culture or HR department, or talk to management and get some information there. However, here are some general suggestions which may help in creating more neurodivergent affirming spaces. One of those is for managers to understand how a person best works and how they understand instruction and assignments. For some people, multi-step instructions may be difficult to take in, and they may be better understood when those things are written down or delivered one step at a time. Some people may need greater specificity and greater accuracy in their instructions that they're given. And communication differences can lead to misunderstandings. So providing clear instructions, but also summarising and checking in after meetings can be really helpful. So emailing everybody a check-in and a summary, just to ensure that everybody in the team is on the same track. Multimodal information as well. So not everybody works best with text. Some people may work better with diagrams, and providing information in different formats helps everybody. Something which is important for RSD and PDA. So I mentioned before rejection sensitive dysphoria and the pervasive drive for autonomy. Inclusive instruction and feedback can help here. So how often do we give feedback that is only ever negative and focuses on the needs for improvement, but we never tell somebody about what they've done well? And that's something everybody in the team needs, whether or not they're neurodivergent. There is an increased need for genuine positive feedback with rejection sensitivity, but also PDA. It does have to be genuine. People can tell when you are not being genuine with positive feedback, and that can have a backfiring effect. That can increase the rejection sensitivity. And by inclusive instruction, what I mean there is not singling somebody out. So if we need to remind people of the rules, we remind everybody of the rules. Or we give feedback that applies to the entire group as a summary rather than an individual. And I would say never ever target somebody in front of a group. That applies to both neurotypical and neurodivergent people. If there's individual feedback needed, that's something that you need to give privately. Using visual prompts may help as well, because then we don't need to give direct instruction. We've got reminders of what we need to do visually on signposts. Increasing choice and autonomy over work is helpful for PDAs as well. So that's helpful for all workers to create a mentally healthy workplace, involving people in planning, giving them choice over their options, and working collaboratively is helpful for all, rather than being just top-down directive. Something that managers may like to consider as well is flexible working arrangements. So some people don't actually do their best work within a 9-to-5 framework. And this may be, there may be limitations with specific roles that do need to be performed in those hours, but or need to be performed in the workplace. But where there can be flexibility in things like face-to-face requirements versus working from home, or the working hours, meeting lengths as well, this may help for neurodivergent folks. Flexibility in schedules or requirements to sit in one space versus movement as well, or the ability to take breaks may be helpful. and adjusting the environment. So allowing people to wear things like noise reducing headphones, reducing overhead lighting, that can really help with sensory overwhelm. Normalizing sensory stimming as well. Many people actually sort of leave fidget toys on their desks these days because that gives them an opportunity to stim and sensory soothe. And staff training as well. So building staff awareness of neurodivergence, as we're all doing here today, and building our sort of ability to self-reflect on our own unconscious biases and reducing microaggressions. Some specific strategies that can be helpful for executive function as well, and that's where people have difficulties with the brain sort of planning and organizing aspects. And sometimes people experience something called executive dysfunction, where they know what they need to do, the brain knows what it needs to do, but they get stuck and they can't actually sort of initiate the task. And so here are some strategies that can be helpful. Habit pairing means pairing something that you need to do that you may not particularly like, maybe boring or routine, with something pleasurable, so that you've got more motivation to do it. This can be particularly helpful for ADHDers because it creates what we call interest-based attention. One of my examples of this, I really hate doing the dishes, and I listen to podcasts while I do the dishes. And that gives me the motivation of, oh, what am I going to listen to tonight while I'm doing the dishes? So that can be helpful for increasing motivation. Habit stacking means adding something new that you need to learn or new that you need to do in your routine into an existing routine, which puts much, much less demand on executive function. It is much easier to remember and do one small part and one tweak to an existing routine than it is to develop a completely new routine. So it can be easier to remember to do that thing. It can be easier to incorporate it into your life. So for example, if you wanted to start meditating and you usually drive home, you might drive home, and just as you get in the door, you use your relaxation app for meditation for a couple of minutes before you start. Or you might even do that sitting in the car before you go through the door. And that's sort of stacking the new habit onto the existing habit. And that particular example might be a helpful way of like separating your work from your home life. Body doubling. So this means working together with somebody else in the same room. You're not interacting, you're not talking, they're just there and they're just present. And this can help increase motivation. ADHDers say it helps increase motivation, but also accountability, that there's somebody else there. And it can help with that executive function stuckness that I talked about, where people know what they need to do, but the brain, the body's just not moving to do it. The brain knows what needs to be done. Body doubling can help with that as well. And that's a strategy that might be helpful within the workplace. If you've got something that you need to do and you're having trouble getting started on it, have somebody else there, set up a meeting room, and you both just work on your projects together. So getting towards the end of today's presentation, I'll just talk a little bit about supports and avenues to find help with getting more information for those who may be starting to recognise that they might be neurodivergent, some suggestions for where you may be able to take your next steps as well. So if this session has brought up issues that are relevant for you, or you may need to discuss your support needs in the workplace, here are some people that you can consider talking to. You might wish to talk to your manager if you feel comfortable doing so. You might wish to talk to HR or people and culture, depending on what it's called in your workplace, or a work health safety contact person. Another option is that many organisations have what is called EAP, the Employee Assistance Program, and you might see signs for contacting your EAP put up in places like your break rooms. So EAP often involves counselling, and counsellors who are there to support you with either workplace situations or other issues. You might like to just have a confidential chat to a counsellor first, just to go through what you're dealing with and figure out what your options might be, who you need to talk to. And a counsellor can help you sort of process that and come to your own decisions about what you need to do next. Your GP is a really good first port of call as well, because GPs are responsible for coordinating our care across all of the different professionals that we see. And a GP often maintains a database or has access to databases for referrals, for people, other professionals that might be able to assist you further. So as far as finding a health professional as well, here are a couple of resources here. So the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, people who are able to diagnose include psychiatrists, psychologists, GPs, and paediatricians for if it's a child that you are seeking help for. And psychiatrists are particularly helpful for people who are considering assessment for ADHD and want to go down the route of taking medication if that does happen to be diagnosed, because that needs to be prescribed by a psychiatrist. So there's a psychiatrist, sort of find a psychiatrist link here. Also, the Australian Psychological Society has a database of psychologists, and you can search by region. There are also a couple of neurodivergent specific services. So Autism Connect and the ADHD Foundation, they can help you put you in touch with professionals in your area as well and give you sort of further information and talk through your options. Finally, I do have some references for the resources that I've cited. Some of these resources might be useful for people to follow up, but I won't go into those in detail right now. What I would like to say is thank you all very much for your time today, and thank you for coming along to this presentation. I'd be happy to answer questions in a moment.
Thank you so much, Miro. That was such an insightful presentation. I think it's definitely shed light on how we can create more inclusive environments that recognize and celebrate different ways of thinking and working. So that's been great. We are open for questions, and I think we've already had a few coming through. I might just read them out for you, Miro. So the first one that we have is, could you please explain what the DSM-5 refers to?
Okay, yes. I'm sorry I didn't explain that at the time. So the DSM-5 is the manual which psychiatrists, psychologists, GPs, paediatricians and other professionals use for diagnosing what is called mental disorders. It is a very sort of deficit-focused term, but it's the classification of different mental conditions, and neurodivergence does have its own area within that. That's not the only system. There's also a European system called ICD, which is, again, it's the International Classification of Diseases, but that does have an area in that for mental conditions and neurodivergence as well.
Thank you, Miro.
Thank you.
We've got another one which says, what are the best ways to support someone who experiences RSD in the workplace?
I mentioned earlier on inclusive instruction. So instruction that applies to everybody rather than just one person. And that means you're not sort of singling somebody out, which is something that's likely to really sort of increase RSD. Or if you do need to give individual feedback, it can be really helpful to talk about the positives first. We call this a sort of positivity sandwich. Talk about the positives first, then provide feedback, but do it in a strengths-based way, and then summarize with a positive. This is something that applies to everybody. This is helpful for both neurotypical and neurodivergent people, but it's particularly helpful for RSD. It can also just be really helpful to be aware that somebody may experience RSD, and because of those sort of repeated judgments over time that may have started in their early life at home or at school, those things mount up. And so somebody might be more sensitive to rejection or criticism or the idea they've done something wrong. Overall, if we all think in a much more strengths-based way, that can be helpful as well.
Lovely. Thank you for that, Miro. The next one is a bit of a literature recommendation. It says, where can I read up more about habit pairing and habit stacking?
Oh, I will let you know where I got hold of those. I am not sure where you can read more online, but they are very common community terms for neurodivergent folks, as is the body doubling term. I actually came across those through Russ Harris, who is one of the trainers and practitioners of what is called ACT therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, which is one of the evidence-based therapies that counsellors, psychologists, and social workers use. Interestingly, Russ Harris is originally a GP. He's also a psychotherapist, and he self-identifies as an ADHD.
Lovely. Thank you for that. The next question is, and it's a really good one, how can we support and accommodate team members who show recurring signs of neurodivergence but aren't self-aware? How do you suggest them talking to a counselor or GP or psych without offending? Much of your talk is about those who are self-aware and can advocate for themselves, but I'm curious about support for those who aren't self-aware just yet.
Yeah. That's a really good question, actually, because you don't want to be sort of overstepping your lane and going into the point of sort of diagnosing your co-workers. We want to sort of sit within our lanes and our boundaries, but we might, for anybody, where they are finding there are challenges, it can be helpful to suggest, well, have you thought of talking about that to somebody? And sort of raise, I'm noticing concern, I'm noticing you're finding certain things challenging. Would you like to talk about it? Respect a person's choice. If they say no, that's okay. I'm not seeing this problem here. But we can all encourage our co-workers to access things like the Employee Assistance Program or see their GP if we notice that they're having particular challenges and struggling in the workplace. And that goes for other things as well. What I'm thinking about here is the guidance that we're given around Are You OK Day, and how we can ask our co-workers respectfully, minding our own and their boundaries, but also suggesting they seek help if we're noticing that they're having particular challenges. So that might be a useful resource to refer to as well.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Miro. There has been some really great questions that have come through. Thank you, everyone. We may not have time to address all of them, but we'll try our best to address as much as we can. The next one, Miro, is about microaggressions. And it says, could you please explain what microaggressions are?
Okay, so microaggressions are, I mentioned things like discrimination, both direct and indirect discrimination, things where people may make judgments or stigmatize neurodivergence. All of those things together, microaggressions is an umbrella term, and it sort of puts all of those things in one box, as well as the experience of it. So over time, those microaggressions add up, and people sometimes refer to them as death by 1,000 cuts, that it's the pain that adds up over time and the hurt that adds up over time. They may be small, sort of one-off things that happen in an exchange in the supermarket or a brief conversation in the workplace, but over time that experience mounts up and is more hurtful.
Thanks, Miro. The next question is, and this is a great one as well. This is just talking about taking small steps at a time. It says,
Mhm.
if I could change one thing in the workplace to help, what could I do?
Mm. Um, okay, that's a tricky one to answer in a way because um, everybody's strengths and everybody's support needs are different. That might be the thing to do, though, is to recognize that everybody has strengths, everybody has support needs. To affirm other people's strengths, to be strengths based, means we notice, pay attention to people's strengths, we affirm those strengths. And also to be aware of their support needs, to be open and allow people to ask for support where they have those needs. That is something we can do for everybody, both neurodivergent and neurotypical.
Yeah, that's a fantastic first step, I think, just asking. The next one, Miro, is about burnout. So it says, thanks,
Mhm.
Miro. This was a really helpful webinar, and we would second that.
Thank you.
Burnout at work seems to be a common issue for many neurodivergent people in my workplace. Do you have any tips for how to encourage reduction of stimulation and encourage rest when so many
Mm,
ADHDers are actively seeking out stimulation in social situations?
yeah, it is really challenging. Burnout is particularly challenging for ADHDers because the idea of rest may become boring and it may be like, it's not meeting my needs for stimulation. Um, so there are many different ways to rest. Ultimately, to recover from burnout, we need to rest in different ways. Rest can be active rest. For people who enjoy physical activity, going for a run helps to burn off the stress, or going for a walk. So physical activity may be helpful. And that may meet the need for movement and physical activity. It might be, so I had a slide sort of earlier on which I might bring up again actually, on how we can reduce burnout. There we go. So while we might need to reduce sensory stimulation, it's about going with a sense of your own needs and learning to tune into that. One of those things that can help is spending time on the spins, on the special interests. And that can give satisfaction in stimulation while allowing for rest, because that might be a really nourishing activity. But I'll say it is challenging when you may need stimulation. And it's about sort of learning to balance those needs as well.
100%. Thank you again, Miro. The next question is quite relevant to our current practices in most workplaces, which is remote work. So the question is, our entire company, which comprises 5 people, works remotely, which is different locations and different states, and
Mm.
is quite challenging, but as well as positive. Any suggestions for those of us who might benefit from remote body doubling?
Yes, that is actually something that neurodivergent workers quite often do. Remote body doubling is something you can do on Zoom. It's not the same as having a person in the same room, but as far as the accountability side of it, you've got somebody sitting there on your screen and you can do exactly the same thing. So you can set up a Zoom session or Teams or whatever it is you use for video connection. You both decide at the start how long you're going to work for before you check in. You mute yourself and you just leave your camera on and you're both there working together. So that is actually quite often used for the remote body doubling. Some people prefer to have a check-in moment as well during their body doubling, where they take a break, just check in together. And that might be helpful to sort of set that up as well.
Thank you again, Miro. This might be our last question.
Mm-hmm.
It says, in this day and age, open plan workplaces are the norm, and
Mm-hmm.
neurodivergent people do have stimulus struggles with too many distractions. Do you have any tips for leaders to be more inclusive and respectful of people's need in this physical environment?
Yes. So it is challenging. It's also challenging where the workplace may just only have that one environment. This will all depend on what managers are able to offer and what is inherent to the role. And again, I'll just sort of state my limitations that my qualifications are as a counsellor. I don't have expertise in the sort of people and culture areas or management, but I do think some flexibility is helpful. Considering sensory needs, like, do we want to change the lighting and use more ambient light than overhead lighting? There may be sensory needs around heat as well, and just all workers being more inclusive and checking in around, do we need the heater on, or is somebody actually overheating from that? If people can use noise cancelling headphones too, then this helps. What those do is help rule out, they sort of tune out overstimulating aspects of the environment or things that may be drawing attention elsewhere, and help sort of reduce the overall level of sensory input as well. And that can be really helpful. And also just some flexibility around giving people breaks and the opportunity to, what I often suggest is the opportunity to go outside, have a break on your own or a break in nature, just to sort of decrease all of the sensory overwhelm.
Thank you again, Miro. I think this might bring us towards the end. And I would just wanted to say it has been such a great session, and a lot of the comments have echoed the great takeaways that we have gotten from this presentation. So thank you again, Miro.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Yeah.
I appreciate that. I just wanted to quickly mention that this event is run as part of the WorkSafe Tasmania month. So please head to worksafe.tas.gov.au/month to see what in-person and webinars we have in store for the rest of October. There will also be a survey link towards the end of this session. We'd love to hear your feedback. And thank you all for attending today's webinar. It has been great. Please do have a great rest of your day and stay safe, everyone. Thank you again.
Thank you all very much.